Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 27 February 2025. It is the 162nd anniversary of the birth of George Herbert Mead, who was born in South Hadley, Massachusetts on this date in 1863. Mead is usually counted as a pragmatist, being an important influence on John Dewey. Arguably, however, Mead was as influential in psychology as in philosophy, making contributions to social psychology and to sociology. In particular, Mead is recognized as the founder of symbolic interactionism, which is sometimes presented as a psychological theory and sometimes presented as a sociological theory. The concern of symbolic interactionism, especially as it appears initially in Mead's work, is the formation of the self as the individual develops in its social context. Mead's understanding of psychology and the self is closely bound up in his conception of time. Mead showed no interest at all in history in the conventional sense, but he gave a series of lectures about time, posthumously published in 1932 as The Philosophy of the Present. I've argued in several episodes that our conception of history ought to be formulated in light of our conception of time, that time and history need to be understood as integral perspectives on the world, but there's often a disconnect between philosophy of time and philosophy of history. But there is a way to philosophy of history through Mead's conception of time. Mead's philosophy provides us a way to connect time and history, thus to connect history to the self through the individual's experience of time. Mead's The Philosophy of the Present opens with an uncompromising assertion of presentism. Quote, "The subject of this lecture is found in the proposition that reality exists in a present. The present, of course, implies a past and a future, and to these both we deny existence." Unquote. None of my usual reference works have a definition of presentism, and that surprised me a little bit. However, I did find a reasonably concise exposition of presentism in E.J. Lowe's A Survey of Metaphysics. Quote, "According to one philosophical view of the nature of time, only those things which exist at the present moment, now, really exist at all, and the only qualities which these things really possess are the qualities that they possess now." Unquote. There's a sense in which presentism is as much a thesis in metaphysics as it's a thesis in the philosophy of time or the philosophy of history. And in this connection, it's instructive that I found an exposition of presentism in a book on metaphysics and not a book on philosophy of history. Presentism as a thesis in metaphysics, however, touches on a metaphysical philosophy of history, and presentism has always been a problem for history. History can never exhibit its objects in intuition, to use a Kantian turn of phrase, and so it must infer and reconstruct the past because it cannot observe the past. One paper that Mead did publish in his lifetime, all the rest of his works were published posthumously by his executors, literary executors. One thing he did publish, however, in his lifetime was a paper called The Nature of the Past, which was in a volume, which is a contribution to a volume honoring John Dewey. As with the opening of the philosophy of the present, his paper, The Nature of the Past, opens on a similarly uncompromising note of presentism that underlines what he said in his lectures. Quote, "The present is not the past and the future," unquote. In the second sentence of Mead's lecture, we find another important concept. Quote, "Whitehead's suggestion that, as specious presents vary in temporal spread, one present can be conceived which could take in the whole of temporal reality, would seemingly leave us passage, but would eliminate the past and future." Unquote. What does Mead mean by a specious present? A specious present is a term of art in philosophy, you could say. The idea of the specious present was first introduced in 1882 in the book The Alternative, A Study in Psychology, and was brought to wider attention by the work of William James and later C.D. Broad. The Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy says of the specious present that it is, quote, the supposed time between the past and the future, unquote. William James said of the specious present, quote, is no knife edge but a saddleback, unquote. Bradley Dowden, in his article on time in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, asks, quote, do we have direct experience only of an instantaneous present event? Or instead, do we have direct experience only of the specious present, a present event that lasts a short stretch of physical time, unquote. Mead briefly sketches two conceptions of time, one of which is the specious present, in order to contrast them to his own conception, from which these conceptions differ sharply. Quote, the past and the future that appear in the present may be regarded as merely the thresholds of a minute bit of an unbounded extension whose metaphysical reality reduces the present to a negligible element that approaches the world to an instant. This view of reality as an infinite scroll unrolling in snatches before our intermittent vision receives another variant in the picture of reality as a four-dimensional continuum of space-time, of events and intervals forever determined by its own geometry, into which we venture with our own subjective frames of reference, receiving momentary impressions whose present character, unquote. I want to discuss both of these rejected conceptions of time, but since I've already mentioned the specious present, I will continue with that. The fundamental confusion of the specious present is not widely recognized, but is not difficult to see. The specious present is an artifact of conflating an empirical conception of time with a formal conception of time. An empirical conception of time can be measured and studied by science. That is to say, it can be studied by empirical methods. Further along in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on time by Bradley Dowden, he writes, quote, if it is thick, then how thick? Does the present last longer than the blink of an eye? Among those accepting the notion of a specious present, a good estimate of its duration is approximately 80 milliseconds to 3 seconds for human beings, although neuroscientists do not yet know why it is not 2 milliseconds or 7 seconds, unquote. This is all well and good for the empirical study of time, but the idea that underlines the specious present isn't something empirical at all. It's a formal conception. Therefore, it is an idealized model of time that could regulate scientific research but couldn't be falsified by it. The idealized formal conception of the present is known as the punctiform present. That is to say, the present that has the form of a point. And we know that a point is unextended. This is the familiar idea that the present is merely the boundary between the past and the future. And since the past no longer exists, the future doesn't yet exist, and the present is the unextended boundary between the two of them, that leaves little or nothing to time. It seems to leave time nowhere at all, making of it a kind of nothingness. This seems paradoxical from the point of view of human experience, but again, the idea of the punctiform present is an idealization, like other idealizations familiar to us from science, like a frictionless pendulum with a weightless string. These ideal models of palpable actualities allow us to formulate a scientific treatment of matters that would otherwise be beyond human calculation and comprehension if we attempted to be true to every jot and tittle of experience. But we don't even try to be true to experience in this way. We only try for a good enough approximation to the real world so that we can derive testable consequences from our model. The punctiform present is an ideal model of the present, and it's part of a familiar assemblage of idealizations of time, such as treating time like a one-dimensional continuum and extending the past continuum indefinitely, perhaps infinitely, into the past, and the future continuum indefinitely, perhaps infinitely, into the future. If we employ, whether implicitly or explicitly, the model of the time continuum infinitely extended into past and future, we have an even stronger idealization that can never be cashed out in experience, though it may be regulative of our interpretation of experience. All of these come together in a package along with the punctiform present. If the punctiform present is truly unextended, as would follow from its idealization, then measuring its thickness is conceptually incoherent. Nevertheless, we find these kind of conceptual incoherencies all the time, especially when we attempt to study elusive realities that have never been nailed down by science. And time is this if it's anything. We have a science of time measurement, chronometry, but no science of time itself, though not for lack of effort. There are physicists, of course, who claim to have given a scientific account of time, but there's no agreement on this, as indeed there's no agreement on philosophical accounts of time. Our idealized formal conception of time is as fragmentary and as uncertain as our attempted scientific and philosophical accounts of time. It's extraordinarily difficult to formulate a truly abstract conception of time, since human experience is always and only temporal experience, and we don't have anything to set against human temporal experience so as to compare and contrast it. It's like the problem of a fish coming to an understanding that it is surrounded by water and lives the entirety of its life in water. Is the difficulty of a fish to understand that it lives in water a profound or a banal observation? I ask this question because of the well-known essay by David Foster Wallace, based on a commencement speech, the full title of which is "This is Water: Some Thoughts Delivered on a Significant Occasion About Living a Compassionate Life." Wallace began his talk with this theme, quote, "There are two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over to the other and goes, 'What the hell is water?'" And David Foster Wallace ended the lecture on the same note, quote, "Awareness of what is so real and so essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us all the time, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water, this is water. It is unimaginably hard to do this, to stay conscious and alive in the adult world day in and day out," unquote. One of the reasons I wanted to mention Wallace's "This is Water" is the reaction to it that I've seen. I once spent some time reading responses to "This is Water," and they were almost evenly divided between those who thought it was a deep and profound statement of the human condition, and those who thought it was so trivial it was scarcely worthy of the praise that had been lavished on it. This metaphor of fish and water also holds for the human mind and time. We could equally well remind ourselves over and over again, this is time, this is time. So is this awareness of the pervasively temporal character of human experience a profound or a banal observation? It could be either profound or banal, depending on the context, or it could be both. I won't try to settle this today, but either way, the problem is inescapable. Rather, time is inescapable for us, and time is a problem. Therefore, the problem of time is inescapable. In the paragraph I quoted earlier, I said that there were two conceptions of time that Mead rejected. One of these ideas was bound up with the specious present, which I've now discussed. The other of these was a conception of time based on physical theory. Throughout the philosophy of the present, Mead shows an interest in then-current scientific accounts of time and natural history, citing the work of Einstein, Eddington, Fayol, and Minkowski. So it's not surprising that he takes up a conception of time that has been derived from this work. So I'll repeat the part of the quote that deals with this. Quote, "This view of reality as an infinite scroll unrolling in snatches before our intermittent vision receives another variant in the picture of reality as a four-dimensional continuum of space-time, of events and intervals, forever determined by its own geometry, and into which we venture with our subjective frames of reference, receiving momentary impressions whose present character," unquote. The idea of history being a peculiarly human perspective on four-dimensional continuum of space-time has made the leap from the physical sciences into popular expositions of time in physics and cosmology. This view of time has become somewhat common, and we can see that it was already gaining currency in Mead's day. Both physicists and philosophers can now be found who endorsed the view of the world being something like a static four-dimensional continuum. Some physicists go so far as to deny the reality of time, which is something that we would expect from Platonists, but which has become increasingly common among physicists. Everything old is new again, you could say. Carlo Rovelli, in his popular book, The Order of Time, wrote, quote, "We conventionally think of time as something simple and fundamental that flows uniformly, independently from everything else, and from the past to the future measured by clocks and watches. In the course of time, the events of the universe succeed each other in an orderly way, pasts, presents, futures. The past is fixed, the future open, and yet all of this has turned out to be false," unquote. Rovelli doesn't consider time to be fundamental, and he uses cats as a humorous example of something that is not fundamental from a physics standpoint. This is one of those cases in which physicists attempting to translate physics into ordinary language perhaps does more harm than good. We can all agree that cats aren't fundamental in the sense that something is fundamental in physics. Cats are not part of the ultimate furniture of the universe, a contemporary metaphysician might say, and cats don't appear on the periodic table of elements, nor are they produced in stellar nucleosynthesis. But cats not being fundamental should not be used to argue for the idea that cats are illusory or unreal. In ordinary language, cats are a paradigm case of something that exists. If anything exists, a cat exists. One could say that anything that is not fundamental from a physics standpoint is ultimately illusory. But this would be a usage that departs so far from ordinary usage that it would be deceptive to state it in that way. So if we can agree that cats are real, and if we can agree that there are many things that are real in the way that cats are real, but not fundamental in the sense of physics, then we should be able to agree that time is real. Even if we argue that time isn't fundamental, it's not illusory for not being fundamental. Also, it should be obvious that time is more fundamental than cats, since cats exist in time and cannot be conceptualized outside a universe with time, and therefore a universe without a natural history. Not only is time more fundamental than cats, time is also more fundamental than the periodic table of elements, and even more fundamental than the observable universe, since the observable universe, like cats, cannot be conceptualized without time, therefore without a natural history. That makes time among the most fundamental things that there are in any sense, and any physics or metaphysics that ignores this or tries to explain it away is going to end up in absurdity. When you get to something as fundamental as time, your physics had better explain it rather than explain it away. Rovelli's book was obviously unknown to Mead, and I should point out that the obviousness of this is a fact of history. The events of the universe succeed each other in an orderly way, and because of this, Mead couldn't have read Rovelli's book because Rovelli's book appeared long after Mead was dead. Mead introduces this conception of time in physics by referring to the idea of history as a kind of scroll, which is an idea he uses again in a nearby passage. Quote, "There is behind us a scroll of elapsed presence to which our constructions of the past refer, though without the possibility of ever reaching it, and without the anticipation that our continual reconstructions will approach it with increasing exactness. And this brings me to the point at issue. Such a scroll, if attained, is not the account that our pasts desiderate. If we could bring back the present that has elapsed in the reality which belonged to it, it would not serve us. It would be that present and would lack just the character which we demand in the past, that is, that construction of the conditioning nature of now present passage, which enables us to interpret what is arising in the future that belongs to this present," unquote. Scroll time is then, for Mead, as unworkable as the specious present and a four-dimensional space-time continuum. The alternative to these unworkable conceptions of time, according to Mead, is presentism. When Mead is giving an exposition of his own views, he speaks my language, that is to say, the language of emergent complexity, which I've discussed in relation to big history and what I call a complexity ladder for big history. In this respect, obviously, I'm sympathetic to Mead's exposition. Most expositions of emergent of emergent complexity start with C. Lloyd Morgan and pass to Samuel Alexander and then Alfred North Whitehead, skipping Mead entirely. But Mead deserves to be remembered in relation to emergence. Mead writes, quote, "Given an emergent event, its relations to antecedent processes become conditions or causes. Such a situation is a present. It marks out and, in a sense, selects what has made it peculiarly possible. It creates with its uniqueness a past and a future. As soon as we view it, it becomes a history and a prophecy. Its own temporal diameter varies with the extent of the event. There may be a history of the physical universe as an appearance of a galaxy of galaxies. There's a history of every object that is unique. But there would be no such history of the physical universe until the galaxy appeared, and it would continue only so long as the galaxy maintained itself against disruptive and cohesive forces." Unquote. This constitutes a kind of reduction of the past and future to the present. All that exists and all that we need to construct the past and future are to be found in the present, which is pregnant with both. While Mead shows his interest in contemporary science throughout these lectures, I should emphasize that his account is through and through philosophical, so that his reduction of the past and the future to the present isn't like Platonists or physicists denying the reality of time, and it isn't like idealists denying the reality of the material world. Mead's is a philosophical account of time that is consistent with science as he knew it, as we can see in the following. Quote, "The relation of any event to the conditions under which it occurs is what we term causation. The relation of the event to its preceding conditions at once sets up a history, and the uniqueness of the event makes that history relative to that event." Unquote. Here he uses causation and history in a fairly conventional way, so we can see he's not trying to overturn any familiar parts of science. Rather, he's offering us a philosophical way to understand how all of this plays out in the present. You have to read the full exposition of the book to get a proper sense of how he carries out his reduction of past and future to present. As a form of reductionism, we could count Mead's philosophy as a deflationary philosophy of history, as I discussed in my episode on David Hume, and certainly Mead does deflate past and future. He denies them existence. The present is the locus of reality, and Mead follows out the implications of this relentlessly. He's to be admired for the consistency with which he worked out the consequences of his presentism. Sometimes reductionist philosophies leave the reader with a certain sense of despair that some part of the world has been lost. So I want to say that the lesson Mead takes away from this conception of time is fundamentally optimistic, and I think even a spur to action, a philosophical call to take heart. At the end of the book, Mead says, quote, "Our history and our prognostications will be sympathetic with the undertakings within which we live and move and have our being. Our values lie in the present, and past and future give us only the schedule of the means and the plans of campaign for their realization." Happy birthday, G.H. Mead, and thanks for listening.